Hello and welcome to Writing a Winning Grant Proposal, a webinar for VISTA members. I'm Andy King with the Corporation for National and Community Service in Washington, D.C., and I'll be the host for this session. Joining us are Bethany DeSablin and Andy Clark, our partners at Education Northwest, who are the producers and have helped to prepare today's webinar. You'll see all of us in the chat and Q&A to help address questions and support you during the session. Let's begin by looking at our session goals. Here's what we hope you'll get out of this webinar. By the time you finish, we'd like you to be able to, first of all, distinguish between a grant and a gift, and to shift your perspective about how to approach each one of those. Secondly, we hope you'll be able to determine what should be included in an effective letter of inquiry, as well as what goes into each section of a standard grant proposal. And finally, we'll share what you should include to make your grant proposal stand out from the rest. I want to thank those of you who responded to our pre-webinar chat activity about your experience with grant writing or proposal writing. Some of you identified potential funders through research. It looks like others have been involved in writing to some degree. And some of you, it seems, have even been successful, and you've raised some money while others have tried, but you haven't quite yet been successful. And then, of course, some of you haven't even gotten started. So we've got a variety of levels of experience here on the webinar, which is great. And we hope that you can take away some information that will be helpful as you continue to develop resources for your own organization. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this webinar. Our main presenter is Dennis Norris. Dennis is a published author and national trainer on the topics of grant writing and grants management. And Dennis has been a grant reviewer for the Indiana Department of Education, the Toshiba Corporation, as well as Scholastic Publishing Company. Since 2008, Dennis has worked primarily on reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan and is currently the Senior Operations Advisor for the United Nations in Kabul. He also serves as a facilitator for the VISTA Resource Development online course. A little later in the presentation, we'll be hearing from Tiara Campbell, a VISTA alum who is a life-loving young professional, always seeking opportunities to better herself and her community. Tiara was a VISTA in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, with the Schuylkill River Heritage Area. At Vanguard Charitable, a donor-advised fund, she processes donations to nonprofit organizations across the country. Outside of work, she volunteers with her church and climate mobilization. She auditions and acts at local theaters and goes on adventures in and outside of Philadelphia. But now I'm going to turn things over to our main presenter, Dennis Norris.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm very glad to be here today, and I want to thank you for participating. You know, learning about what grants are and how to obtain them and how to have your proposal stand out to a grant reviewer is always an important topic, especially these days when the competition for grant dollars is at an all-time high. So to get a sense of what you're all working towards, I'd like you to weigh in on this chat question. What is your fundraising goal as a VISTA? Or in other words, how much money are you expected to raise? And if you don't have a specific dollar amount, is there a specific activity, event, or project you're hoping to fund? Please enter your response in the chat box and make sure you send to all participants so everyone can see. Thank you.
All right, so we've heard from Suzanne. Looks like her goal is around 12,000. Heather's is 10,000. Then we've got a bunch of you with much higher goals in the $100,000 to $250,000 range. You know, those are really outstanding, you know, really ambitious goals there. A few others are in the smaller range, you know, like a couple $1,000, maybe $5,000. And let's see, Sydney mentioned both cash and in-kind contributions. So that's really great that you've got a range of possibilities there. And Ben says, as much as possible. So sometimes that is the goal, like, hey, we need as much as we can get. Don't ever stop. Yeah, it looks like there's a whole number of you that either don't have a specific fundraising goal or a specific amount that you've been asked to raise, and others don't have specific fundraising responsibilities, in your VAD or your VISTA assignment. But it seems like there's strong interest in this topic, whether it's part of what you're doing at the moment or not. So, so Dennis, what stood out for you here in all of these responses?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think really what stands out is this is very normal. Everybody's sort of all over the map on what they need to raise. And if we ask this question in 2 weeks from now, you probably would have different responses. So it's very normal to be all over the map. And so, again, this is very interesting with really diverse comments. So I think it's obvious that no matter what level of funds you're expected to raise, you're going to have to do that in a variety of ways. And one of those methods will be to obtain grant funding. And I remember the first time I was asked to write a grant proposal. I had absolutely no idea what a grant was or what I was supposed to do. I asked around to people who I thought could help me, but instead of help, I just got a lot of blank stares. And in the end, I just decided to follow the funder's directions to keep it simple and just to spell out what it was that I wanted. The first few grants I wrote were funded, followed by a tremendously long dry spell, followed by a bit more success, and then another dry spell, and that's just how it goes. No one gets them all, but this webinar will boost your chances to provide you with a glimpse of what the other side, that is the side of the grant reviewer, looks for in a solid proposal. One thing is for certain, if you don't submit grant proposals for funding, you have a 100% chance of failure. Hopefully this webinar will take some of that fear away and make you more competitive in obtaining funds. Okay, so first let's talk about the difference between a gift and a grant, because they are definitely not the same thing. And it is very important that you understand the difference between the two before you tackle a grant. Most gifts come from individual donors after they are solicited for it in some manner, either face-to-face or email or snail mail or a special event or something like that. And most money comes from middle to low income people, contrary to popular belief that you have to know a lot of rich people to raise money. Grants, on the other hand, come mainly from foundations. It is a transfer of money from a funding organization, or funder as I will call them throughout this presentation, to a qualified institution, really a nonprofit organization for our purposes today, to accomplish the nonprofit's initiatives. So grants are given quite often to explore creative approaches to existing problems or issues, like hunger or domestic violence or the environment, or to support approaches that have already been proven effective, like stem cell research, low-income housing construction, or veterans benefits. You have to write a proposal to get a grant, or at least some type of formal document that outlines your project and lists how you will measure your project's success. Gifts, conversely, are also known as donations or charitable contributions, and often come after some relationship building has occurred. People are often drawn to a cause and they want to give a donation to support a nonprofit's mission. Typically, gifts can be used for anything: salaries, programs, equipment, vehicles, operations, whatever. Whereas grants, which are often referred to as contracts or agreements, have to be applied to a specific initiative and one that has measurable objectives. A few more points about gifts versus grants. When you give a gift to a nonprofit organization, unless it is an anonymous gift, you will end up in their donor database. The nonprofit owns that list, and they cannot give or sell your name to another nonprofit unless you give them permission. But when you get a grant from a foundation or corporation, that is public information. So I'm able to see each grant that you've received and each grant that a funder has provided. And you're going to see why this is important later on when we discuss grant research. Also, when you give a gift, you get an acknowledgement of some sort. And that usually has information on how much you can write off on your taxes. With a grant, however, you get a binding legal contract that must be signed, returned, and adhered to throughout. In order to keep their tax status as a funding organization, a funder must give away a portion of their income each year. And again, for this reason, all of their information is public and easily accessible. Their board members, their assets, how many grants they've given, how to contact them, funding programs, all of that. You must account for every penny of a grant, and you must measure the results of your project. So a formal binding contract is included when you're awarded a grant. So why is this distinction between a gift and a grant so important? And that's because the language used in seeking gifts and grants is very, very different. This is critical to remember. And if you take away only this one thing from this webinar, you will be miles ahead of most of your competition in the grant field. People give with their hearts first when making a gift. So fundraising and marketing materials intended to solicit gifts are written to strike a chord in a person's heart. Writing that attempts to pull on a donor's heartstrings is appropriate in a fundraising appeal, but not in a grant proposal. A grant is a contractual business relationship, so grant correspondence should always be professional, clear, concise, and devoid of flowery or emotion-laden language. You want to convey to your potential funder that you're prepared to meet their philanthropic goals with your proposed project. So here's an example from the Wounded Warrior Project so you can see the contrast. The gift language on the left is obviously evoking an emotional response and trying to strike a chord with the donor. The writing attempts to make donors mad or sad or happy or whatever emotion does the job. Fundraising language like this is more salesy and it's designed to market the mission of the organization. Smart nonprofits often have several marketing messages that are tied together and used throughout their various sources of media, like website, print media, social media, or written materials. The grant language is more professional, crisp, and clear. It is more businesslike and to the point. The example on the right is obviously not attempting to evoke an emotional response. Instead, we are presenting factual information in an effort to receive ongoing funding for our projects, whatever they are. We're not trying to sell anything here. We're trying to establish a partnership in which we do a project that yields specific results, and we are seeking a funder who provides the money for that effort. So making a grant reviewer smile has a lot to do with both the content of your writing and the style in which you write it. Grant reviewers can tell through the writing of a letter of inquiry or a proposal whether or not the applicant is properly prepared for the task. For example, if the writing is more for a fundraising piece than a grant, a reviewer will assume the applicant does not know the difference between the two, and a level of confidence will have been lost with that reviewer. This is why gift versus grant language is so very important. However, if the language is businesslike and professional, the reviewer can tell that the applicant understands the difference and will probably maintain that understanding throughout the submission of reports and the stewardship of funds once they're received. And that is what you want, because if the structure of the proposal is haphazard and less than seamless, it's not hard for the reviewer to imagine that the management of the project will carry forward in that same way. For a reviewer, it's fairly easy to tell when an applicant has bitten off more than they can chew. For instance, you cannot solve the world's hunger issue, but you might be able to help 300 people on the south side of your city. So if you want the grant reviewer to smile, you should never promise what you cannot deliver. And sticking with the issue of hunger, a grant reviewer will expect that you have a solid grasp on the problem. If you simply state that people are hungry in your city, that will make a reviewer suspicious that you may not have done your homework. Instead, if you provide solid and recent data on the problem and demonstrate that you have a deep understanding of the issue, you are once again instilling that very important level of confidence in the grant reviewer. So grant research is an entire topic in and of itself, and it's not a topic for this webinar. Just know that grant research has to be done in order to find the right funder for your project. There are many resources available for locating grant funders, and here are just a few of them on the slide. In my opinion, the best resource for grant research and information is the Foundation Center. Not only can you research the Foundation Center online database, where you can find virtually any existing grant opportunity, but you can also engage in tutorials, you can read several articles, and you can employ sample tools that will help you along the way. GrantSpace is another excellent resource that offers a learning community specifically designed to meet the needs of grant seekers. GrantSpace, by the way, is a site run by the Foundation Center, so it has the same high caliber of information. I believe that GuideStar.org is a close second to the Foundation Center in terms of being an effective grant research, but you have to dig a little bit. GuideStar gathers and disseminates information about nonprofits for free, which includes their IRS 990 forms. Now, an IRS 990 form is a lengthy tax form that every nonprofit agency must complete each year. It is full of information that is all public record. So when you look at a 990, you immediately get that IRS form butterfly in your stomach because it appears to be horribly complicated. But it's actually very simple, and there is really only one place you need to go to, and that is Section 15. It is there you will learn whether or not that nonprofit received any grants in that fiscal year, who the grants were from, and how much they were for. So looking at the 990s of your competitors is perfectly legal and acceptable, and it's an excellent way to develop a long list of funders interested in your mission and the similar missions of your colleagues as well. So if you're smart, you'll find out who is doing the same kind of work as you. Go to GuideStar.org and take a peek at their 990s. I do it all the time. And this is why I emphasized earlier that grant information is public information, which differentiates completely from a gift. Some of you may be interested in obtaining education-related grants. GrantsAlert.com is a place to find education grants, and in my experience has the most expansive and comprehensive listing of those. And finally, grants.gov is a place to find federal grants. Don't be afraid of federal grants. For any one federal program, there is often an army of individuals called program officers ready to assist you. And for very large federal programs, there are usually introductory or instructional webinars like this one, or even instructional videos, and sometimes even day-long conferences held in major cities for potential applicants. Federal grants are often the largest grants available, and yes, you will have to work a little harder for those. I've had the good fortune to write and manage several large multi-million-dollar federal grants from organizations like USAID and similar organizations from other countries like Canada, Australia, Britain, and Japan, and I find that they are well worth the effort. And the fact is, they're all pretty much the same. If you write clear, professional, business-centric text and you follow directions, that's really it. They're all pretty much the same. When you do grant research, your goal is to locate the funder whose philanthropic goals match the focus of your project. If it's a good match and they're interested in funding you, then you will be asked for some very specific things. And at that point, you will need to listen carefully and follow directions.
All right, now it's time for us to hear a little bit from Tiara Campbell. As I mentioned, Tiara was a VISTA member in Pottstown, Pennsylvania with the Schuylkill River Heritage Area, and now she works as a Randstad Grants Associate with Vanguard Charitable. So Tiara, what do you have to share with us?
Hello everyone and fellow VISTAs. What I have to share, while this webinar is not focused on finding grants, I do want to add a couple of points from my experience with grant research. And a pointer is to start as soon as you're able, start searching for grants. I found that when I started in August 2016, I noticed a lot of grant application rounds had already ended. But fortunately, I found out that new rounds were starting in the fall and earlier in the next year. So once you begin, record the grant opportunities that seem to best match your project in an Excel spreadsheet or some kind of list that you can refer to when the grant rounds do open. And I also suggest, once you're writing them, to keep a copy of your grant applications and all the information that you submitted, that you submit later on for reference. So as an overall way to frame grant writing, you want to be clear on the who, what, when, where, and why when you're writing the grants. So who are you, what organization are you representing, and who are they? Mainly, who is the organization, and who are you asking for funding? You want to know who the funder is and what their funding priorities and mission are. And then you want to be clear what you want the funder to do for the project. What do you want them to fund? I'll mention budgets later, but maybe you're only asking for one phase or one part of a project to be funded, so be specific about that. And Dennis will dive deeper into this as he goes through the letter of inquiry and sections of the proposal. But I just wanted to point that out. Also, know when the project is occurring, or give a timeline for your project. If it's phases, perhaps you're starting something in the fall, so you'll break it down September, October, November, or something like that. Provide a timeline. Make clear what the steps are that need to be accomplished to reach those milestones in your project. And then another part of kind of who the organization is where the project is occurring. So specify the project area and give context of why the project is occurring there, because this is an investment, so you want to make sure that all the points are clear, and definitely make sure why you want to do the project, why it's important, and why you're asking the particular funder. So you want to answer every question that's outlined in the grant application, even if you think you answered them already. So I'll just point out my picture there. I'm glad to have taken that after my project and even my term was over. That's a photo of me in the middle in the poncho, cutting the ribbon on a about 1.5 mile trail segment in C.R.O.A.K County, specifically Pottsville, Pennsylvania. So the who, I was with Schuylkill River Heritage Area. It's now called Schuylkill River Greenways. That's kind of a facilitator in building trails, and I'll give a shout out to Bob Folwell at Schuylkill River Greenways. And so that's who the organization was. What we were doing is trying to make a critical trail segment connection as part of the Schuylkill River Trail that extends from up in Schuylkill County into Philadelphia. So it was in, as I mentioned, Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and we wanted to get it done in the fall of 2018, from what I remember. So I gave those milestones, and why we were wanting to do that project is because it was identified by the state of Pennsylvania as an important trail link. So that's briefly my who, what, when, where, and why for that project.
Great, thanks, Shara. Thanks for starting us off on the main focus of our webinar today. Now we're going to talk about Project C.R.O.A.K. In my early days, I wrote grants for a large school district in Indianapolis. And one day I was approached by a group of third-grade teachers who said they had a desire for more computers in their classroom. So my response to them was, okay, well, name one other third-grade class that doesn't want the same thing. So the teachers just wanted someone to give them computers because, well, they're teachers and they deserve to have them. No argument there, but it's just not going to happen. So we had to come up with a creative approach to an existing problem, which, remember, is the definition of a grant, for which the acquisition of computers would have to be a peripheral byproduct. Luckily, that very same year, their school was given a curriculum emphasis of environmental science so that everything they taught, from math to spelling to science, emphasized the environment. And luckily, a creek ran behind their school. So one day we walked to the creek and I asked them, how can we capitalize on the good fortune of having an environmental emphasis school with a creek running behind it? And that's when Project C.R.O.A.K was born. The creek is actually part of a watershed leading to the Gulf of Mexico. So we set up partner schools along the watershed. At the beginning of the year, a fictitious frog was released into the creek, and during the school year, kids along the watershed would report on what it was about their segment of the watershed that could hurt or help the frog as he made his way downstream. There were two problems we sought to address with this project. The first was that kids needed to learn at an earlier age the interconnectivity of the environment, or the fact that throwing trash into the creek ultimately affects everyone who lives along the creek. And number two, kids needed to learn at an earlier age how to work and learn in teams. And there was plenty of research to back up our claims. So how did we get started with Project C.R.O.A.K? Well, I did some grant research looking for funders who had as their philanthropic interest the partnering with public schools and the teaching of children about the environment. I located the National Environmental Education and Training Foundation in Washington, D.C., whose philanthropic interests match our project perfectly. Their instructions included a letter of inquiry, or LOI, as the initial approach, and we will learn about these shortly. So I wrote an LOI using a non-fundraising, business-centric writing style, striving to stay very clear and concise above all else. This project could be accurately described as cute and fun, but we didn't want our writing to be cute or fun. So Project C.R.O.A.K won a national award for project creativity and implementation, and it evolved into an innovative middle school initiative called the Signals Project, and that led to the Jason Project, which is a high school project tied to Dr. Robert Ballard, the gentleman who discovered the Titanic. In the end, there were millions put into the school district, and the Jason Project became so big that it had to be moved to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. Needless to say, the third grade teachers in all of the third grade partner schools got more computers than they knew what to do with. In fact, the desire for computers became almost forgotten as teachers really got into the project and the problems that we were solving. So again, I think this is a good example of how the need for a gift can turn into a grant opportunity, and how a massive public school / private industry relationship was born. So let's review that Project C.R.O.A.K grant process again using this flow chart to help us. Through my grant research, I identified a funder and ensured that their philanthropic goals met the parameters of my project. Next, I simply followed their directions. If they wanted me to call them, I would have called them. If they wanted me to email them a synopsis of my project, I would have emailed them. But more than likely, a funder is going to ask you to write a letter of inquiry, commonly called an LOI. And this is exactly what they asked for. Sometimes a funder will skip the LOI and ask you for a full proposal. Since these two options will be about 95% of what you see, we will focus in this webinar on both the LOI and the full proposal. And finally, once I was successful and obtained the grant, I received a notice of the award and a contract, and then I was free to implement the project with my new business partner. Throughout this webinar, I'm going to explain what a grant reviewer expects to see when you submit an LOI or full proposal, but I'm also going to tell you how to make that particular section exceptional in their eyes. The vast majority of funders out there will ask you for an LOI, as I mentioned. An LOI is simply a short letter to a potential funder asking them whether or not they're interested in your project and if they want to see more of it through a full proposal. In the letter, you will mention how much money you want and why you want it. But the real reason for an LOI, again, is to ask the funder for permission to submit a full proposal. The first paragraph should say it all. I want X amount of money to fund Y project, which will be used for Z. And the Z could be materials, supplies, consultants, salaries, whatever. But you have to be specific about what the Z is. And then the rest of the LOI should briefly support what you stated in the first paragraph. Exceptional LOIs can be read and completely understood by the reviewer in mere seconds, ideally after a careful reading of the first paragraph and a skimming of the remainder of the letter. LOI should be razor sharp in focus and content with no extra words. It is a one-page letter full of crisp, clear sentences that are very easy to read. Remember, funders read hundreds of these things, and the way to make yours stand out is to be brief and clear. You are trying to make your way into the first cut, and being cute with the language or not following directions will get you thrown immediately into the trash can. The project you are describing in the LOI will have measurable objectives, and your grant reviewer will want to see that you understand this. Your LOI then should very briefly include these and how they will be measured. You don't have to be extremely detailed in an LOI. Just show your reviewer that you understand that measurable objectives are the most important part of your project. You never want more than 3 or 4 measurable objectives for any project, and you should be able to encapsulate these into one short paragraph. And then finally, people have a tendency to see funders as Santa Claus, and they feel that they have to grovel and beg and plead to get funded. Instead, make your writing exude confidence. You are a capable, skilled professional in your field, communicating with a capable, skilled professional in another field. Your writing should reflect this sort of equilibrium. Next, we have a question for everyone. In the chat box, answer the following question by typing which letter you think is the correct answer to the question. And this is the question. What do you do if the funder simply says, write a proposal? A, submit a letter of inquiry. B, write a narrative about your project. C, submit a standard proposal format. Or D, send an email to the funder and ask what they want. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that question.
All right. We've got a little bit of alphabet soup, but it looks like the predominant answer that folks are choosing is option C. Yep, a couple of combos, A and C, B and D.
Okay. Well, we'll move forward because the correct answer is C, submit a standard proposal format. But what the heck is that? And what does that mean? Well, that's what I'm going to show you now. But first, it is critical, absolutely critical to remember this. Whenever a funder provides you instructions on what to write and how to write it, those must be followed. Everything you're about to learn is not applicable when the funder provides instructions. Instructions are king of the mountain and must be followed to the letter. In the absence of instructions, which in reality will be the norm, there is a loose industry standard that you can follow, and that's what I'm going to show you now. Okay, so when a funder asks for a proposal, they typically mean a 10-page document with certain elements, and we're going to walk through each one of these. Sometimes they have page restrictions, and they might ask for a 5-page proposal or a 3-page or a 7-page or whatever. The proposal still needs all the elements, but you must reduce them proportionally to match the page count. But again, most of the time there will be no mention of a page count at all. So in cases like that, a 10-page proposal is an industry standard that you will be safe to follow. More and more these days, you will see that a funder does not want to speak to you. They do not want you to email them, but maybe they do want an LOI or a proposal as their initial approach. It's not that they're unfriendly, but you are competing with many, many other people and the volume is just too heavy. So if you make it through the first cut, there will actually be people with whom you can speak most of the time. Most people in this field agree with the industry standard that I'm about to show you, and that a proposal must have certain elements, but you may hear them called different terms. For instance, instead of a needs statement, you may see problem statement. Instead of methods, you may see activities. Instead of an executive summary, you may be asked to write a concept paper. Just remember that these are all pretty interchangeable. So a standard 10-page proposal usually consists of the elements you see here on the slide within the page parameters listed. Are these page parameters set in stone? Not really. A funder will expect you to know the basics, and these are the basics. For instance, the methods section of a proposal is the meat of your program. If you only write half a page on what you plan to do and then write 3 pages of introduction, for instance, then your proposal is way out of proportion, and it will become obvious to the reviewer that you do not understand which sections hold the most importance to them. So now we're going to look at each one of these sections individually. Starting with the executive summary. The executive summary is the cover page of a proposal, explaining to the funder in brief terms who you are, what you want, and what you plan to use their funding for. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it mimics the LOI, and the two can be somewhat interchangeable. An executive summary, however, should be a bit more expansive. An executive summary can also be used later as the framework for a press release or marketing tools. And this is very important for you to know. An executive summary is typically the last thing written in a grant proposal, but it's the first thing and quite often the only thing read by a reviewer, at least in the first pass. If you don't write a good, crisp, easy-to-read executive summary, chances are you will go no further. When I write a grant proposal, I usually set it down for a few days when I'm finished, and then I go back and write the executive summary with fresh eyes. I agonize over these things because I want my words to be laser focused. Why? Because I know, and now so do you, that the executive summary is either going to open the gate for me or close it. And of course, I want to make it through that first cut so I can walk through that gate and get one step closer to the grant. Now let's look at the introduction. You use this section to get acquainted with or to shake hands with your funder. Tell them who you are and why you exist. If you're here to help single mothers, then briefly tell the grant reviewer why this is so important. Show why your organization is relevant to the community. If there is an award your organization has received or a major grant it has obtained, then tell the reviewer about it and don't be shy. You'll also want to expand on your mission and or vision statements to bring them to life a bit more. I'm sorry, because I know a lot of organizations pay thousands of dollars for these, but most are incredibly boring, so make sure yours is not. Make them compelling and interesting. Tell that person something that makes you special or that's really cool about you. For instance, if your organization serves single mothers and your board is made up of 1/3 previous clients, that is something you're going to want to mention. Yes, it's obvious when an applicant is new to the grant game. And if you are, it's okay. But never try to beef up your intro to make you into something that you're not. Instead, and especially if you're new to the grant game, say that you are a new organization or you have not sought out grant funding before, or whatever the case. And then let the funder know that, even so, you have a capable and professional staff who know their topic well and are confident in providing a creative solution to an existing problem or issue. Everyone has to start somewhere, and a grant reviewer knows this. Right after the introduction comes the goal statement and the related objectives. Don't be fooled by the fact that this section is less than a page. The goal statement and measurable objectives are the most important part of any proposal. And interestingly, it's a place where many grant writers fall short. So let's look at what needs to be included. A goal is a desired result that a person or an organization envisions, plans, and commits to achieve. A goal is something that is very ambitious but is still achievable. For instance, a goal may be to reduce the number of homeless individuals in your community. The goal doesn't really go into specifics, but it clearly states what you intend to accomplish. It describes what success looks like for you. Objectives are smaller scale outcomes that add up to the overall goal. They define what will be accomplished by each individual strategy or implementation step to attain the goal. Your objectives will allow you to accurately measure the effectiveness of your program towards the attainment of that goal. So by SMART objectives, I mean objectives that are specific, it details exactly what will be accomplished; measurable, the outcome is defined in a way that can be measured; attainable, the target is something that is possible to achieve; relevant, the objective relates to the overall goal; and time-bound. There's a defined completion date. Any objective is obtainable if you have unlimited time. SMART objectives are important for any type of work plan, not just for grant proposals, and I'm guessing many of you are familiar with them. But it's good to be reminded to include them in any grant proposal. You'd be surprised how many submissions do not include them, and when they're not included, the proposal will automatically be rejected. So what is a grant reviewer looking for in your goal statement and objectives? Your goal should be ambitious but achievable. These days, many proposals use such words as outcomes or outputs, inputs, strategies, and many other terms for simple objectives. Whatever they're called, stick to the SMART formula and be clear, simple, and straightforward. Furthermore, objectives serve as your roadmap. These are the things you will measure in your approach to the problem or issue. The funder gives you money because they believe you can reach your objectives with your creative approach. Objectives are important because if you are successful, the funder has not only met its own philanthropic goal, but perhaps your program can be replicated and the entire community will continue to improve based upon your approach. A good example of this would be stem cell research as a treatment for certain types of cancer. At some point, a funder took a chance on this creative approach to the problem of cancer. Once this proved to be successful, more and more funding became available and the process of stem cell research was repeated and enhanced. So exceptional objectives are those that do a very good job of measuring, because this makes the process of replicating or even not replicating that much more important. Remember, Thomas Edison tried 1,000 different ways to make a light bulb, and when asked about his success, he placed the emphasis on his failures because he learned of 999 ways not to make a light bulb. So objectives that make good common sense are the most attractive to a grant reviewer. For example, stating that you are going to measure the number of opioid-addicted veterans in your city and that your measurement criteria will be the number of veterans who visit the hospital asking for opioid addiction literature is, well, pretty weak, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. As a reviewer, my first question about this objective will be how you expect to obtain a realistic number and what method you will use, because what you've stated, again, just doesn't make any sense and would be very difficult to achieve. A better objective would be to measure the number of opioid-addicted veterans who choose to identify as such at the local VA hospital. This makes more sense. It's within your grasp, and it will probably produce more reliable data to meet your objective.
All right, so we're going to give you all a chance to apply what you've just learned about the goal statement and objectives. So to do this, you'll use the chat panel again. As you can see on the screen, the goal of the Signals project is to address the lack of science curriculum in middle schools for at-risk girls. One objective of this goal states that we will increase class offerings in biology, chemistry, and physics by 10% each year over a 3-year period. So now, using the chat panel, please let us know what you think is good about this objective or what you think can be improved. So be sure you say good or improve before you give us the element, otherwise we won't know what you're saying. But if you don't see the chat panel, again, look for the little button and open up that chat panel and let us know what you think is good, currently good, or what you think could be improved about this goal statement. All right, we've got a number of comments coming in. So a couple of you mentioned that there's a clear objective that has a time element included in it, that it's specific. A couple of you mentioned that.
And those are all correct responses. Very good.
All right, a couple things to improve. Doesn't really say the age range of the girls. How is it helping them? Is it measurable? How would you actually go about measuring some of it? Yeah, and then there are some other details that aren't included here that some of you were mentioning about, where is this, what's the geographic area, what's the scale or the scope, and some specifics about the curriculum. Are these first-year students, or, how is that going to work out?
Yeah, these are all really good questions. And there's a fine line between including too much information in an objective and just kind of including it all in one brief sentence. And some people get carried away, other people don't have enough information. So this is why it's good to write a grant proposal, especially the objective part, as a team. You can sort of feed off of each other and see what's too much and what's not enough. So all good comments. So we're going to look at another objective too.
Yeah, so let's jump ahead to the next slide. Here we go. So this objective states that we will, quote, instill a love of science among middle school girls. Again, use the chat. Tell us what's good about this or what could improve it. So we want to instill a love of science among middle school girls. All right, so the one that's jumping out, it's not measurable. How do you measure love? It's vague, it's subjective, it's not clear what the deliverables are. It's not SMART, as many of you have pointed out. So Dennis, I think they're getting it.
Yeah, this is good. You're right. This objective needs some work. It's probably relevant to the goal, but as many of you noted, it's not very specific and it's not measurable. My notes say exactly the same thing. How do you measure love? And there's no time frame, so the project would have until infinity, I guess, to meet this objective. So really good work on these. It's clear you're seeing how to tell if objectives are SMART. So that was the goal here. Now let's move on and look at the next section of the standard grant proposal. Good work to everybody. So we're going to look at the needs statement or problem statement now that shows the funder that you've done your homework and you know what you're talking about. Aesthetically, when you write a needs statement, it's best to form an inverted wedge or an upside-down triangle by presenting your findings on a wider scale, then honing it down to a regional or statewide scale, and then honing it down one step further to show how the problem affects you locally, or even how your problem affects a single individual. With Project C.R.O.A.K, I started with national environmental education statistics and a quote from a famous scientist about why environmental education is so important. Then I showed a graphic from the Indiana Department of Education on how team learning was more effective than individual learning. After I looked at the individual schools' statewide scores in both math and science, which were low, we tried to incorporate an increase in those scores into my objectives. So I did not paint a picture of such gloom and doom that the proposal reviewer would think, oh my gosh, this problem is totally unsolvable. But I did have solid research backing up my claims, and I presented it all in a very graphical and easy to understand manner. My 1.5-page needs assessment looks somewhat like a miniature research paper, complete with footnotes and quotes. Finally, you want to leave the reviewer with the opinion that if he or she ever needs more information on the topic of your mission, you would be the local organization to call. With Project C.R.O.A.K, I used a variety of different sources for my information on environmental education, and in the process, I developed a pretty good surface knowledge of the topic, enough to know the key concepts and where to look for more. Of course, I'm not an environmental education expert, but my needs assessment has given the impression, hopefully, that if someone were reading my proposal and had a question on the topic, they could give me a call and I could speak intelligently with them or direct them to the proper resources. This is a very condensed version of a needs statement. I'm going to read this. In his speech to the United Nations in 2015, President Obama stated that childhood hunger is our nation's #1 priority. Following that declaration, the state of Indiana committed $50 million towards programs fighting childhood obesity and mandated that soda machines be removed from all elementary and middle school cafeterias. In the Indianapolis public school systems, soda machines were removed from all the schools, and student blood pressure was monitored throughout the 2015-16 school year. The result was a lowering of blood pressure over 55% of the student body. So you may have noticed a few things about this needs statement that aren't perfect. Let's use the chat again to share what you think could be improved about this needs statement. What suggestions do you have for ways to make it better?
Andy King has disconnected.
Okay, that's fine. We're looking at some of the chat responses, and they're very good. It's covering a lot of different things, but as a grant reviewer, here's where I see some of the problems are with this statement. First of all, it doesn't really give any local data on the scale of the problem in the state or in the local community. That's important to me. It mentions that the state mandated removing soda machines from schools, but it doesn't reference the research making the link from soda to obesity, which would have been very helpful. Did you notice how it mixes some of the methods or strategies and results into the needs statement, like removing the soda machines, for instance? This is an easy mistake to make. Since this is just about the need, it would be better just to focus on the problems of obesity and blood pressure rates among students in the Indianapolis schools and the links between soda and obesity and blood pressure. Leave your strategies or your solutions to the problem for the next section. Okay, well, this was just a quick example of what goes into a need statement and how to make sure it's focused to support your proposal. Let's move on to the next section of the standard proposal format. And that would be the methods section. Now, remember how all of this started with your project. You were probably sitting around with your friends or coworkers and said something like, hey, you know what, we could do this. Well, that's what the methods section is. It's your plan. It's that first great idea that you've honed into a workable project. Explaining it professionally will be the bulk of your proposal for the next 3 pages of a 10-page proposal. A methods section maps out each step of the way for your project. What will you do the first day, the first week, and the first year? Each method you propose must always lead to the completion of one of your objectives. So let's go back to Project C.R.O.A.K again. My methods section listed all of the other partner schools along the watershed. I inserted a timeline as to when the frog was scheduled to appear in their section of the watershed. I explained in detail what was expected of each school, and then I told the funder how we would produce a comprehensive CD of the project when it was completed. The methods section can also include a brief introduction of the primary personnel involved in the implementation and management of the program, further instilling confidence in the funder, especially if the personnel are exceptionally qualified or have managed grants in the past. The methods you use for your project must achieve objectives in the most cost-effective manner. They should include a division of labor so that no one individual is burdened with the bulk of the work. It's also acceptable to list individuals or professionals from outside who are qualified to ensure project success or give it credibility. And if your project demands new staff, it is acceptable to include job descriptions or resumes, if staff is already chosen, as appendices at the end of the proposal. In the methods section, you should have timelines, and they should be realistic and based on milestones. If possible, you should also build in periodic reviews of the entire project so you can make any adjustments. This would include doing periodic measurements of your objective to gauge progress or lack thereof. The evaluation section is next, and it's best defined as a method by which you will measure your objectives. What instrument will you use to determine your level of success or failure? An exceptional evaluation will be designed by someone with evaluation expertise. I always like using people from the education field for this. I just find their methods are the best and most creative. Evaluations include things like pre-test and post-test, surveys, knowledge gains, and several different types of methods that really depend upon the type of program you're implementing. Of course, evaluation should tie into both the needs assessment and the objectives. In the needs statement, you have shown that you understand the problem by presenting current and reliable resources. The measurement of your objectives should add to the field in some manner. Perhaps your project will be so successful that someday another grant writer cites your findings in his or her needs statement. This section includes not only the evaluation, but also how the project will be monitored and what people will learn from the project's overall implementation. Along those lines, evaluation should include an explanation as to how you plan to share what you've done. For example, a white paper may be produced that you post on your website and that of your funder. However this is done, it will be your responsibility to disseminate your findings so that others may see what does and even what does not work. Your funder will want to know whether or not you met your objectives, and they will want you to spread the word about your project. From both an educational and marketing standpoint, this is good for both of you. So it's very important for you to relate to your funder that you do not see them as your sole investor for eternity. So you'll want to mention your plans for future funding or sustainability. Funders will want to know if you have sought out other funding, someone with whom they can share the load. This is a perfect place to show the investments that have been made by others in the community or even by your own organization. Shared costs are very attractive to a funder, and if you have those commitments going into a proposal submission, it only makes you that much stronger. If you don't have other investments to show, the funder will want to know how you plan to sustain your project over time, like with more grants or private donations or costs for services, those sorts of things. They're all relevant. Your method for sustainability is important, yes, but not as important as acknowledging to your funder that you understand their funding is not a one-shot gift for a one-shot project. You should care more about your project than to let it die after their funding expires. Show that you have a plan to address this. Also, tell your potential funder of any in-kind contributions that will be included by your organization or others. For example, these include things like consulting services, facilities usage, equipment, or anything that has a value associated with it other than real dollars. Discuss the various relationships you have developed so far and the possible funding routes created through government and private industry leaders, philanthropists, large corporations, or individuals such as that. Your overall plan for sustainability should be creative yet realistic, and it should stress that sustainability is the ultimate goal. Now let's look at the budget section, which is always my favorite. Make sure your budget accurately reflects the activities of your project. You'll want to clearly show what the funder will provide and what you and others will provide. Don't include budget items that are strictly forbidden by the funder, obviously. If that information is not known, then you can assume any category may be funded, like salaries or consultant fees, supplies, insurance, etc. If a funder strictly forbids funding for salaries, for instance, they'll let you know that through their instructions. Also, avoid large amounts under vague categories like contingency or miscellaneous. Always prepare a brief paragraph explaining the numbers. You don't have to be extremely detailed because often the numbers speak for themselves, but having a text-based explanation on how you arrived at those numbers often helps the reviewer understand what you want. Make sure it's easy for non-financial people to read this and understand it. Unless directed otherwise, it's always best to separate those costs associated with personnel, like salaries, consultant fees, or taxes, from those not associated with personnel, like supplies or postage or vehicles. This practice just makes for a clean, well-segmented budget that is easier to understand. You'll also want to provide the full picture by explaining the budget with clear descriptions of both revenue and expenses. And finally, an exceptional proposal indicates periodic examination of variances between the budget and actual expenses and a plan to make corrections. So if you budgeted $500 for office supplies for 6 months and you find yourself at $499 after 1 month, don't panic. And no matter what, never, and I mean never, try to hide this somehow from a funder. Instead, call them and explain what happened. Most of the time, they'll allow you to transfer from one category to another. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they'll even give you more money to cover unanticipated expenses. Again, it's not a gift, it's a business relationship. Okay, now we're going to hear again from Tiara.
Okay, so this is a sample from my budget. It's only a portion. I did have other sections in my budget, but this is for the trail project I mentioned earlier. So I would say for your budget, include all the materials you may need for the project, research and add an average cost in your spreadsheet, and you can include a contingency as a safety cushion, as long as Dennis mentioned, it's not a large category. And I would say don't rely on one grant to fund your whole budget. Target the items to the funder if possible. I found that some funders are more inclined to fund equipment. Some may only do materials, and few seem to cover staff costs or contractors, etc. Also, for tips when a grant is not funded, first look over your application for any gaps, unclear explanations, or disconnect to the funder's mission. And if you could have someone with fresh eyes do this, that would be helpful too. Evaluate whether your project is correct for the funder that you approached. And sometimes you even need to evaluate your project itself. Is there any weakness in the project that could be improved? Perhaps it seems that your organization doesn't have the capacity to do the project. Maybe you could rework it some way. So take the best notes that you can and try again next time.
Okay, thanks, Tiara. Great stuff. And just to add a few more to Tiara's list of tips if you don't get funded, always take the opportunity to thank the funder for their consideration of your proposal and request they send you information as to why that decision was made. Sometimes they will even copy the evaluator's sheets and send them to you. Being able to see the grant reviewer's notes is an incredibly smart thing to do. Personally, on those occasions when I have not been awarded a grant, I have never once been told by the funder that I could not see the reviewer's notes. So after you look these over, you may decide to try again, and that's the perfect chance to reconnect with the funder and see if that is permissible. Of course, complaining about the funder does no good at all and may even cause you harm. Remember, it's not personal, and also remember that the philanthropic world is a small one, so you might want to consider that if you are going to complain. I try to view the rejection of a grant proposal as a really good edit of my project by unbiased outside individuals. And as Tiara mentioned, learn from the experience and try again. Okay, so let's talk about if you are funded. So what happens if you're funded? You want to be sure that the funder has not altered your proposal in any way, especially the measurable objectives. For instance, if they want to add an objective that you were not considering, then you need to determine whether or not this additional objective will cost money, and if so, how much? Or they may want to fund everything except for the consultant you need for your project. If that is the case, then you may need to alter some of your objectives and or your evaluation and find this money elsewhere or take it out completely. This kind of thing does not happen often, but it does happen. So be sure your proposal is being funded in its entirety as it was submitted. If not, renegotiate the terms of your proposal. Now, once you come to an agreement, determine when and how your actual money comes in. It may come in all at once. It may come half now, half at some benchmark point in your project, or you may have to use your money up front, your own money, and then apply for reimbursement. You need to know all this before you sign. Okay? We don't expect you to remember everything we covered today, so we created a PDF with tips for what to include in each section of the proposal and all the resources we mentioned earlier, as well as a few others listed at the end of the packet. And one last note on resources. Don't forget to check out a few of the main fundraising professional networks, the American Grant Writers Association and the Association for Fundraising Professionals. Check in your area to see if there are local grant writer networks that would give you a peer group to network with. Okay, next steps. So what can we do right now, today, at your organization to get started on obtaining grants? Well, besides finding the right funders for your project, here are some suggestions. Write an introduction of your nonprofit using grant language. At some point, you're going to need to do this, so why not do it now? Dust off the old term paper skills and start doing some research on the problem or issue your mission seeks to remedy. What national or international data can you find? What might this data look like on a more statewide or regional scale? List some examples of how this plays out locally. Here again, eventually you're going to need this data, and you will have to keep it updated, so no better time to start than the present. And finally, I'm sure you all have a project or two in mind, what are your rather lofty but achievable goals for this project? Can you write out 3 or 4 measurable objectives that lead toward the attainment of these goals? A good rule of thumb is to ask yourself whether or not your measurable objectives will add to the field of study surrounding your mission. So I want to thank you all for your time today. It's been a really great chance to get to talk to you, and I sincerely hope you're walking away from this webinar not only with some valuable grant writing information, but also with a little bit of a glimpse at what grant reviewers are expecting from you. I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Dennis. And as he mentioned, we'll get to your questions in just a moment. But before we do, we would love to know what you think about this presentation. So you'll see on the right side of the screen a poll with an evaluation has just opened. There are 10 simple questions. Use the scroll bar all the way to the right to navigate through all 10 questions. Please remember to click the Submit button at the bottom so that your answers will be recorded. And while you're working on that, we will go into the Q&A session, and I'll remind you that now the Q&A panel has closed. So click the little triangle, the little caret symbol next to the letters Q&A. That will reopen it. You can type in your question and submit it. And we will get to those in just a second. But now I'm going to ask our operator, Elan, to come back on the phone and give us instructions for those who have dialed in.
Thank you. And at this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Once again, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1.
All right, great. And while we're waiting for questions to come in on the phone, we've got a number of them lined up here. First up is a question from Sydney, who asks, I have a question about family foundations. Is it appropriate to write with more emotions, i.e. more gift language, in these types of grants versus non-family foundations? So Dennis, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer is no, it's not appropriate. Just because the word family is attached to foundation, don't be fooled by that. A lot of times that means that it's a wealthy family that has a philanthropic interest of some sort. There's typically a board with family members attached to it, but there's no difference between them and any other type of foundation. Any type of correspondence to them, whether it be an LOI or a grant proposal or even a simple email, should always be in your most professional writing, as I said earlier, devoid of the flowery, fundraising, salesy kind of language. Be professional. Just because they're a family foundation, it still means that you're going to have a business relationship with them. So that's a good question, and the answer is no. You should not use that sort of language in any type of grant correspondence.
Okay, great. A couple other questions about, writing the proposal itself. So Edward wants to know how to establish a timeline when the thing you're getting funding for is an ongoing project.
I'll answer that briefly, and then I want to see if Tiara's got anything to add, because she just kind of did this with her trail project. But you don't have to be exact with a timeline. I mean, you you want to show the funder that you understand that, you know, for instance, you might be getting their funding for a year, maybe 6 months, whatever the case may be, and you can just show that during this chunk of time, this is how I'm going to use your money, or this is what we're going to do. These are the reports we're going to generate. These are the outcomes we're going to generate. So it's just, a timeline is really just a way to show the funder in a graphical format, typically, that you understand that this is the time frame from within you're going to try to reach your objectives or your goals, whatever the case may be. You don't have to be real specific, and you don't have to say that, you know, on August 5th we're going to end here, or unless that is the case. But if not, your funder's not going to penalize you for not having exact dates. You can be general usually, but it's still a good idea to include that. Tiara, do you have anything to add on that?
Not sure if Tiara, maybe you're on mute.
Okay.
All right. Well, maybe we'll have her come back in just a minute or two. Let's see. We've got other questions here. Paige is curious about that reimbursement model that you mentioned, where your organization might have to pay for things up front and get reimbursed by the funder later. Do you have any sense of what percentage of funders are using that kind of model in their funding?
Great question, Paige. And I would freak out if I saw that too. And it's a very, very small percentage, and these are typically in certain silos of nonprofit organizations where you might have to come up with the initial amount, and then it's a cost type of grant where you pay for certain things and then you get the money back, and you know, you're not even going to be interested in that unless you're a very large nonprofit that can afford to pay that sort of money up front. A lot of the work I do, not a lot, some of the work I do in Afghanistan are grants like that, where you sort of have to put up front some money to, say, for instance, build a road, and you might have a milestone where at 200 kilometers of road, we're going to get reimbursed for all the costs that we've incurred. But, you know, my company or the people I work with can afford to do that. So you're not going to see that very often. To answer your question, it's very, very rare.
Can I chime in? Am I?
Oh, sure.
Am I on? Oh,
you are.
I did have one state grant where it was completely reimbursable. Just to add to that.
What did it entail, Tiara? What was it for? Can I ask?
It was a Pennsylvania Greenways and Recreation grant, I believe, and all the costs were reimbursable. So you had to spend first and then get it back. Just as an example, I'm pretty sure.
Just curious, was it to build something?
Yes.
Okay.
For the trail.
That's typically what it is. It's usually to build something that you have to pay for the upfront cost of, you know, design and engineers and material, and then you get reimbursed. So unless you're working in that sort of thing, and unless it's for a very particular, usually a government type of grant, you won't see it.
All right. Well, we've got a number of other questions here. We'll try to move through as many of them as we can. Amber Lee has a question about the section of the proposal where you talk about other additional funding. She said, if you don't have other funding for your program, what are some good ways to show the funder your plan to sustain the program besides just applying for other grants in the future? Any thoughts on that?
Well, sometimes that's all you can say, that, you know, we like our project enough that we're going to just keep looking for other grants. It kind of makes your project weak, but at least you're showing the funder that you understand that that's part of the deal. So some ways to say that are, as you just said, we're going to continue monitoring grant projects that are out there. We're going to do proactive research where we're looking at family foundations, trying to match up philanthropic interest with what we're doing. We're going to look at possibly state or federal government assistance with this. So, that's kind of the minimum baseline that you can say, well, I'm going to keep looking. If you can add to that some ways that you plan to sustain your project, for instance, take Tiara just as an example with her trail, you might say, well, we're going to charge a minimal fee or have a donation box or something at the trail to help offset the cost. Anything like that is going to tell the funder, okay, well, they get it. It's not going to be this one-shot deal. I'm going to give them money. They're going to do what they say they're going to do, and then it's just going to go away. So if you can make them feel better in any way, shape, or form in that respect with, elaborating somewhat, that's going to help you. Tiara, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I would quickly add, too, that you can mention some non-monetary initiatives that you're trying to do, such as form partnerships with other organizations. Maybe you're seeking in-kind donations or something like that to show that you're not just relying on grants, you're also relying on relationships and partnerships and sometimes and donations as well.
Okay, great. Let's turn to the phones and see if we have a caller with a question. Turn to our operator, Alon. Do we have any questions on the phone?
I do. Our first question today is from Nikki Taylor.
All right. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, I'm Nikki. My question is, I didn't get, you named two grant writing association. I have the American Grant Writing Association. What was the second recommendation for as grant writing? You mentioned two associations.
The other was the American Association of Fundraising Professionals.
Okay.
I think I said that right.
Yeah, AFP.
Yeah, AFP, American Association of Fundraising Professionals. There's chapters all over the country for them. It's a large organization. A lot of times they'll have luncheons that will discuss grant writing methods, and maybe even you'll get to know your local philanthropy folks. So that's a good resource to tap into.
Thank you.
As a reminder, to ask a question, press star 1.
All right. Do we have any other callers on the line?
Sir, I'm showing no further questions at this time.
Okay. Well, we've got plenty here, and we'll try to get through what we can in the remaining minutes that we've got. Let's see. Susanna wonders if there are any differences when applying for grants of different sizes, say $1,000 versus $5,000. Are there any differences? And she asked specifically in consideration of taxes, et cetera.
Ooh, taxes. First of all, in terms of language and being clear and concise with your professional writing, there's no difference at all. You might be writing for a $5,000 quick, supply sort of grant, or a $6 million grant to Australian aid to build a road down the middle of Uruzgan province in Afghanistan. No difference. One's going to be more text. They're going to want to know more detail about what you're going to do, especially if it's involving engineering and materials and buying, bulk supplies and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, if it's going to be more complicated in a larger project, there's going to be more to write. But in terms of the actual style of writing, it's not going to be any different at all. It's the same. And in terms of taxes, that's something that I've never really run into very much that is a requirement, other than, salaries. If you're paying somebody, does this grant cover taxes? That's something that you would just have to work out with a funder. Most of the time it does, yes. Like, for instance, when we get a USAID grant, we employ quite a few people, and it's salaries and wages and taxes and all of that's included. So it's really something that we have to clarify very clearly with the funder that, yes, we do cover taxes, or no, we don't, especially when you're working in another country. That's when it gets very tricky. So I hope I've answered that question. It's, you know, when in doubt, ask the funder. If you're to the point where you're being asked to write a proposal, then you're going to have somebody to talk to. You'll have a program officer and a phone number and an email, and do not hesitate ever to ask them questions. I've never ever in my career had a program officer that wouldn't answer me, or if they didn't know the answer to a question, wouldn't try to go seek it somewhere else. They're very helpful.
Yeah, and Dennis, I'll add from my own experience that the accounting department in your own organization can likely help you with some of those budgetary questions, or you know, some of the financial side of the grant application.
Exactly.
So back on the topic of grant language and gift language, Michael says that his organization has a lot of templates on how they like the language and format of a grant to be, but the language is very informal. It's like gift language. How much liberty do you think I can take in using, you know, a more professional language, more grant language, when my organization actually wants to set the pace of that?
Well, I want Tiara to answer this too, but I'll answer it briefly because the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. If any of you have ever taken my class with resource development, you know my stance on that. I'm very, very strict about fundraising language and grant proposals or LOIs. They're not the same. A gift is not a grant, and I try to just drive that home every chance I get in my class. So my response would be change the templates, but I'm way over on the other end of the spectrum. I don't think Tiara is there with me, so I want her to answer this question.
So I would say that the grants that I've had, it was very clear with the questions to answer, what questions were in the application and what to answer. So my suggestion would be to answer the questions and follow what the application is, and then avoid the flowery language, but there's nothing wrong with stating the issue with facts, and perhaps it'll kind of, and try to find out what the organization, what their reason is behind the templates that they have. And I would say go with what the grant application has in it and explain your intention of just trying to get the project funded, and that doing what the funder is requiring is going to best get you there, which I'm sure the organization is trying to get to as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tiara. See that she's more user-friendly in that answer than I am. I'm the first to admit I'm pretty adamant about, you know, if I'm reading an LOI or a grant proposal and I see something like "Together we can change the world" with an exclamation point, I don't like that. So I mean I'm going to be your business partner. I don't need cheerleaders. So that's just kind of my stance.
Agreed.
All right. We've got a couple questions here on a similar topic about how to include or whether to include graphics or pictures or images in your grant proposal. Is that effective? Should it read like a report, or maybe present the images as if it were a presentation?
I saw that question. I'm glad that you brought that in, Andy. I feel like a good grant proposal is balanced. It has graphics. It's got some bullet points that are not overused. It's got some you know, offset quotes and some footnotes. It's very balanced and it's easy to read because it's a mixture of different things. There's a book called Your Mac is Not a Typewriter, or Your PC is Not a Typewriter, and it's written by a lady named Robin Williams. And I think it costs less than $10. It's really short, but it's Desktop Publishing 101. And I bought that book years ago, and I never go anywhere without it. It's really a good resource, and it talks about how to balance something like that, and how, for instance, if you block text something and you have a line of a paragraph that has 3 words in it that are spread across the page, how annoying that is to read, and you know, why you shouldn't do that. It's got all those rules in it, so I would highly recommend that book.
All right, great. And I see we are at the bottom of the hour here, so I'm afraid that's all the time we've got for questions. We did have a lot of great questions, and sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But I do want to take this time to thank our lead presenter, Dennis Norris, as well as Tiara Campbell, our guest speaker, and to invite all of you to join us again for another VISTA webinar coming up. You can see the next couple on your screen. You'll also get an invitation in your inbox, so please watch your email for that. So thanks again for joining us, and also thanks to our production team at Education Northwest, consisting of Andy Clark and Bethany DeSoblin. Again, to Dennis and Tiara, terrific job. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.